this iteration of our Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series titled Power, Protest and Persona, Vladimir Putin and a Russia in Flux. I want to welcome you all for joining us this morning. And if you're watching later, again, thanks for taking the time to check out our programming. My name is Brian Fonseca. I serve as the director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy in the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, and I'll serve as your moderator this morning. We are honored to have three distinguished faculty joining us from FIU. First, Dr. Tatiana Kostanova, who's a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations. The second is Dr. Rebecca Friedman. Dr. Friedman is an associate professor in the Department of History and is director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab. And certainly last but not least, and no stranger to our lecture series, David Kramer. David serves as the director of the European and Eurasian Studies program and is a senior fellow in the Václav Havel program for human rights and democracy. I want to welcome our three faculty for joining us. So the format of the day is I'm going to ask our faculty to provide some initial opening remarks, 7 to 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, something in that range of just some thought-provoking comments that will get the conversation started. I'll pile on a few questions, at the conclusion, and then hopefully engage the audience, which I see we got a good growing audience, engage the audience in the discussion as well. So as our faculty are talking, don't hesitate to use the question and answer box to pose questions, and I'll weave them into the conversation as we go through the program. So, I mean, look, at the end of the day, the Vladimir Putin persona is no secret. It's pretty well known around the world, whether it's images of Putin riding a shark or riding a bear or showcasing his judo. There's no doubt that, sort of the persona of Vladimir Putin has sort of proliferated. However, there's lots of questions as to whether or not that's merited, whether or not Putin is struggling to maintain, his sort of power and influence over Russia. As the program was billed, as this lecture was billed, a lot of anticipation that was around the plebiscite to amend the Russian constitution in June and up to July 1st of this year. And so lots to talk about. And so with that, I want to engage our experts. I'm going to ask Dr. Kostanova to go first, and then Dr. Friedman, and then our brilliant David Kramer sort of to close it out. So Dr. Kostanova, if you can jump in.
Thank you, Brian, and hello, everyone. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of the panel and to share my thoughts about these recent important events in Russia. In the context of the coronavirus pandemic that affected all our lives in so many different ways, those developments somehow have not received enough attention, yet they are very important for a number of reasons for the future. So in brief, what happened was that in the week of between June 25th and July 1st, the Russian voters were called to cast ballots of approval or disapproval of a large package of constitutional changes. The turnout was reported by the Central Election Committee to reach almost 68%, with more than 78% of the Russians who participated voting yes. In the short time that I have been given today, I'd like to organize my comments around the three sets of issues. First of all, why was a referendum called? And did they need a referendum at all? The constitutional changes which were proposed by the ruling party, United Russia, at the beginning of this year. The official introduction of the proposal was made by a famous person, famous from the Soviet Union times, the delegate of United Russia, Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman who flew in open space many years ago. And then these changes were passed by the parliament in March. A referendum was initially called for April, but then it was postponed by COVID-19. There are no provisions in the Russian political system that require voters' approval in such cases. Yet President Putin insisted for a referendum. The expectation on his part was, and the goal, as he also explained it, was that a popular vote would give much needed legitimacy to those changes. One of the prominent sociologist and political theorist from Moscow, Greg Yudin, described this event as a theater, but a very important, a very well-played theater, as he put it. An effort to at least show appearance of popular support. Ironically, by the day of the last day of voting, July 1st, copies of the Constitution with the new amendments had already been printed and stocked in bookstores all over the country. So actually the voting took place after the Constitution was even published, printed. So in practice, I would call this a plebiscite asking for support of decisions that had already been made. And we have seen that especially populist leaders with anti-democratic tendencies very often rely on plebiscites or referenda during their reign. Another even more important issue is the scope of the reforms. The scope was wide, very wide, extremely, affecting over 40 articles of the Constitution, the basic law. Some experts were quick in calling this new basic law that emerged the Putin's constitution, compared to the Yeltsin's constitution that we usually call the Russian Constitution of 1993. In terms of substance, amendments were introduced in three major areas. Those were not only political, but I will start with the political because they are really the kind of the heavy part, the most important part of those. In the political arena, the most important changes were those that affect the distribution of power. The famous in a row clause was removed from the article on the maximum number of terms that a president could serve, thus discounting previous terms. Also, next, nullifying previous terms in office served mainly by Putin and Medvedev in the past would allow President Putin to serve his first term under the new law starting in 2024. And from then on, he would have another series of 2 terms of 6 years each. Another important amendment also that affects the opposition as well concerns high level of government officials who must now not have had foreign citizenship or residence permit, and the presidential candidate should have resided in Russia for at least 25 years. It used to be 10 years, this requirement. Now it's up to 25 years, which basically puts famous figures of the opposition, such as Navalny, out of the presidential race. Also, particular ministers, heads of law enforcement agencies in particular, shall be appointed by the president. The Russian president already had important powers with regards to appointment. Now these powers have expanded even more. In the socio-economic field, I would like to just mention 2 very important important changes that might have also had some impact. First of all, the minimum wage should not be lower now than the subsistence minimum. The poverty line should not be below the poverty line. And also there is something for the retired people. Now the Constitution provides for regular indexation requirement for regular indexation of the pensions, which is a constitutional rule now. Thirdly, in the field of morale and cultural norms, there have been several interesting amendments to the Constitution intended to cement what they call Russian values. For example, faith in one God is now mentioned in the constitution, and also defining marriage as solely between a man and a woman, something that it reflects not only cultural values it's supposed to, but also the rationale behind it. Part of it was to increase turnout. Perhaps it did, I don't know, but the sociologists will tell us in the future whether it affected voter turnout for the referendum. Also, the Constitution formulates now Russian language, which is defined as state forming. So it's codified as even more important. And there is an interesting provision to protect historic truth, which what they call basically imposing sanctions on those in the country and outside of the country who destroy monuments, for example, of Soviet soldiers that were raised, especially to commemorate the Second World War. And the third important set of questions raised by the big problem of what is the nature of these constitutional amendments, and what kind of future can we predict or envision for the Russian Federation. Now, with regards to Putin himself and the President Putin, some experts have characterized the amendments as a constitutional coup, which was designed to keep Mr. Putin in office for a very long period of time, making sure he stays in power, some people say even indefinitely, which would be until 2036, when he will be over 80 years of age. Now, the question is, or until needed, as they say. So the question is, and we're not quite sure for how long he plans to stay as president, whether he envisions his political future as in some sort of another role also. But does it depend only on him, this decision, or there are other also factors that would affect his period of staying in office? But for sure, this is also one way to, I think, to secure for himself life immunity from prosecution because of this option. For the system itself, the big impact, the big implication is that the events legitimize the system that had been built up since 2000, since the first year in which he became president. So now he has been made an arbiter among elites, and these elites remain tied to his staying in office for their fortunes. So basically what we can conclude as the result of these changes constitutionally is further strengthening of what they call power vertical in the Russian political system, the concentration of even more power at the center of the system. That may have implications for both for the domestic arena, domestic public, but also internationally for the formulation of foreign policies. At the same time, the lack of checks and balances continues and is even further deepened. So this would be a big challenge for democratic performance, for the democratic practices that we would expect to see finally taking place in Russian society. So my final, just concluding remark at this point of our discussion is that the changes were intended to keep Putin's legacy, to transition his system, political, socioeconomic, and cultural, to the future generations. At least this was the intent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Excellent overview of sort of what's packed into Putin's provisions to consolidate going forward. Rebecca, if I can come to you, you're up. You need to unmute. Sorry. Rebecca, if you can unmute. Yeah. All right.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for having me this morning, and thank you, Brian, for moderating, and to Tatiana for her remarks. We're going to shift gears a little bit here now for a few minutes, because my job today really is to give Putin the long view, to talk a little bit about the genesis of his persona and where that gets us today. I myself am a historian, so I'm not a political scientist. I'm a historian of Russia, of the modern era. And so I think what I can bring to the discussion of thoughts on Putin, the man, the leader, and Putin, one in a long line of similarly strong and macho Russian leaders. Question mark. Is he one in a long line, or does he stand alone? So there's nothing new, even as Brian suggested in his open remarks, about stating that Putin's persona is central to his strength. His seemingly endless reign, his ability to manipulate the system, and that his hyper-masculinity, his manliness, are at the center of it all. There are examples everywhere that will be familiar to all of us. No one needs to look further than machismo's close tie to nationalism and militarism and Russia's annexation of Crimea, or to the Victory Day celebration in 2015, when on May 9th, during the Victory Parade, marking the 70th year anniversary of Germany's surrender in the Second World War, 500,000 people marched in a so-called immortal regimen with photographs of their relatives who served the Great Patriotic War, in which Putin himself took part, carrying a photo of his father. There's nothing subtle in Putin's creation of an invigorated national political culture. Nothing. Major weaponry had been restored to Russia's victory parades in 2008 on the eve of Russia's invasion of Georgia. We can also see an instance of the Russian regime's ongoing efforts to highlight Putin's toughness in the face of Western challenges head on. He presents a strong, macho, and most decidedly Russian. Simply by way of example, in many of the political, sometimes campaign-oriented, whatever that means in the Russian context, TV spots meant to galvanize or lock in support from his populace, Putin has projected an image of strong, tough man. Here's some examples. In a political ad from 2015, we learned that, quote, a bear doesn't ask permission from anybody. This ad, the famous bear ad, echoed this resolute tone, using only short video clips and images over a dramatic musical soundtrack heavy on the drums. Without any narration, viewers are shown various scenes of destruction, including Kiev's Maidan Square in flames, a beheading in the desert, massive flooding, along with footage of falling ruble exchange rates. While these images were interspersed with more uplifting ones of Russian cosmonauts and Olympic athletes, the overall message appeared to be that the world was a dangerous place and that not just anyone can protect. A strong leader, a real man, was needed to confront the forces of chaos that were threatening Russia and to manage to achieve victory over any foes despite such travails. And of course, Putin is always the answer, although I can't help but say that fear tactics are not anathema to an American audience either, but maybe we'll come back around to that. Of course, too, this leadership cult is not new in the Russian context, as I implied, not unique even to Russia at all. While Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev chose the term cult of the individual, kult lichnosti, often translated as cult of personality, to condemn Stalin's mode of governance and the pervasive and ingratiating worship of Stalin, the leader, it has also been used more casually in the contemporary Russian context to describe the proliferation of Putin images in the press and the extraordinary variety of material Putinyania or Putin mania generated over the past 15 to 20 years that broadcasts his importance in the popular imagination, whether in support or parody of his political role. Partly, of course, for Stalin or Khrushchev or Stalin's rendition of Lenin, the cult itself was a Soviet version of religious worship. It's old news that the icon corners in Russian homes, peasant huts, became red corners of worship, replete with replacing the icon with an image of Lenin, as in the early 1920s. But the phenomenon of Putin is also other. There are more layers worth rehearsing here, so allow me a few minutes to do so. On the one hand, elements of satire and the presence of both official and unofficial Putin madness distinguish the Putin craze from the personality cults that surrounded Soviet leaders. On the other hand, one aspect that I would argue, and many argue, that distinguishes Putin is his mobilization of machismo in Putin-centered politics. To the extent that there is a personality cult in contemporary Russia, the personality at the center of it is defined in highly gendered, and one can argue sexualized terms, shaping the tenor of both domestic and foreign policy. Of course, I'm just going to scratch the surface. Gender. Ha. Gender is one of the most readily available and recognizable aspects of identity, which is one of the reasons that using the symbolism of machismo, masculinity, works well as an aid to authority building in the political arena. Indeed, politicians and activists often use very familiar cultural notions of masculinity, femininity, homophobia, heteronormativity as political tools in their performance legitimacy. Gender as performance becomes a way to create and sustain legitimacy. This is certainly true for Putin throughout his reign. His aggression at home and abroad have been legitimized and almost justified and perpetuated by the gendered cult of leadership that's grown around him. The public relations campaign accenting Putin's macho status began very early on. During his last few months as prime minister under Yeltsin in late 1999, and it has so often been associated with the military. Photos of Putin's flight in a fighter jet as early as October 1999, while visiting a military base in southern Russia, kicked off this ongoing effort. And as Putin settled into his first term of presidency, the machismo campaign accelerated and expanded. By 2002, the Putin manly man brand was visible and audible in the Russian pop song, A Man Like Putin. If only we had audio here. Other audio, music, performed by a female duo who endorsed Putin as a politician and as an ideal man. The song rose to the top of Russia's pop charts and became a propaganda song often heard at state-sponsored pro-Putin rallies. The chorus of this catchy ditty featured a frustrated woman in search of a man like Putin, full of strength, a non-drinker who would neither abuse nor abandon her. As Putin remained in office as a two-term president and then as a prime minister for a term, followed by subsequent stints in the presidential seat, the singers got their wish. Putin seemed unlikely to vacate his position and seems unlikely to vacate his position of power. Desertion was not and is not on the horizon. Whether in this footage of Putin saving a crew of journalists from my Siberian tiger that you mentioned by shooting it with a tranquilizing dart, a photo shoot of Putin enjoying a shirtless fishing or horseback riding trip, an image of Putin zooming around a track behind the wheel of a Formula One racing car or hurling his martial arts opponents to the ground, Putin was being pitched to the public in strongly gendered terms that relied on this idea of normative masculinity. As his time in office wore on, Putin was increasingly portrayed by his public relations team and his supporters as strong, decisive, tough, manly, successfully defending Russian national interests at home and abroad. Cue the draconian response to the feminist punk band Pussy Riot. This image of Putin, with its emphasis on physical masculinity, was not created accidentally. It's widely accepted that Putin's image is controlled by Kremlin image makers. Their task is to ensure that Putin's public relations efforts target specific groups within his domestic audience, portraying him as the ultimate Russian action man, capable of dealing with every eventuality. Okay. Likewise, Putin's ideological position is founded on the reassertion of Russia's strength and sovereignty. Putin would let the West dictate neither how Russia could be run internally nor how to define Russia's interests abroad. This illustrates the centrality of normative masculinity in Putin-era Russian domestic and foreign policy. Part of this masculinity involved an evident heteronormativity and homophobia. Here there's much to say, but I'm going to say very little, don't worry. But let me tease that the relationship between Putin and Trump fits into this somewhat homophobic, homoerotic vortex, where publics view them as interconnected, but in ways that sometimes mock the very notion of same-sex love and desire. One scholar notes that the ascendancy of Trump in the American context has given rise to new heights of erotic representations of Putin and his masculinity. Of course, political crises often become sexualized. If we think even of the French Revolution, you'll find pornographic outpourings about the royal family. In that era, people drew cartoons. Now, people are able to express themselves in a different way, with memes, online, and such. The sexualization of Putin and his persona comes in many forms, including the bromance with Trump and the calendar of women. Homophobic imagery and speak have become mainstream in the Russian context. And I'm wrapping up here. In fact, homophobia is all over Putin's speak and discourse. Putin used homophobic terms to dismiss the Georgian Rose Revolution, for one, casting it as gay. Reacting to a reporter's question following the Georgian events, Putin stated, "A Rose Revolution? Next they'll come up with a light blue one," which for those of you who know Russian, light blue is slang for gay male. Putin's ally in that conflict, the president of South Ossetia, likewise remarked of Georgia's president, "Saakashvili is far from having democratic values, not to speak of male ones. He doesn't have any of those at all." So completely emasculated. Okay, please allow me now to conclude this discussion of Putin and his persona, of which I could say so much more, by sharing a couple of thoughts on today and the Russian responses to Corona in particular. These days, of course, echoes of the past and its draconian methods of asserting Putin's power arise amidst increasing protests, as we heard, will hear more about and heard from Tatiana, from various publics, and to combine with up-to-date technology, both to combat Putin and his allies and for them to assert control. The state can enter into people's lives in completely new ways. Brian knows this. This is happening under Putin's watch today in the era of coronavirus. Today's cult of the leader includes efforts, also in use in other countries, to track individuals' compliance with quarantine, for example. The way it works, as many of you must know, is that as soon as the digital code is created on a cell phone, the clock is ticking. It allows individuals a certain amount of time to perform their activities, tracking movements. Some areas in Russia are adding a system of downloadable QR codes to track the populace and battle the pandemic. The Nizhny Novgorod region, about 250 miles northeast of Moscow, recently began this system. Moscow, however, under Putin's watchful eye, has been slower to the party. The decision to not go with the QR codes came as Moscow's mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, acknowledged that a huge number of questions arose about requiring this code around the city. And opposition politicians and rights groups pushed back hard. One opposition leader called it the creation of a digital concentration camp, certainly evoking the past. Today, Russia, under President Vladimir Putin, appears to be less willing to embrace the kind of sweeping state-run tracking favored by other authoritarian nations amid the corona pandemic, perhaps mindful of provoking public anger and worry that the monitoring could become a permanent fact of life. What, however, does this mean about his present-day leadership, his persona, his style? Is he any less of a man? The end. Thank you. That's
Excellent.
it.
Thank you, Rebecca. Appreciate that. David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Brian, and thanks to Rebecca and Tatiana for doing this together. We are having this webinar at a very challenging time for Mr. Putin. Just yesterday, in the neighboring country of Belarus, there was an election in which Alexander Lukashenko, who has been in power for 26 years, apparently rigged an 82% victory, and that has sparked massive protests in Belarus, the likes of which we haven't seen before. Lukashenko is one of the most authoritarian leaders in Europe, thoroughly corrupt, has been in bed with Russia and out of bed with Russia, if you will, to build on Rebecca's theme. And he is facing arguably the biggest, Lukashenko is facing the biggest challenge in his 26 years in power. This is a problem for Mr. Putin. Putin cannot stomach and accept the notion that Ukrainians twice, in 2004 and 2014, Georgians in 2003, now possibly Belarusians, go out into the streets and demand better from their leaders. That is a scary prospect to Putin. He has also faced protests in 2011 and 12, after the Duma elections in December 2011. There were sizable turnouts in Moscow and St. Petersburg protesting those Duma elections that were also fraudulent, and they continued until May of 2012, when after Putin was sworn in as president, he decided to launch a pretty nasty crackdown against those protesters. Mr. Putin's facing another challenge, this time out in the Far East. where in Khabarovsk, he had his authorities arrest a popular mayor, Sergei Frugal, and brought him back to Moscow for a trial supposedly on murder charges that date back more than 15 years ago. This has sparked massive protests in Khabarovsk. And by massive, I mean some 10 to 20% of the population in the city has turned out. We have seen sympathetic protests in Vladivostok and other cities in the Far East, and even signs in Moscow and St. Petersburg of support, despite the fact that Khabarovsk is some 4,000 miles away to the east. So Mr. Putin, after the vote that he conducted that Tatiana described, in which he supposedly won 78% of the vote, is now not looking very strong and powerful. There are more and more Russians who seem to be fed up with his rule. There was a Levada survey recently that showed his level of trust among Russians. It is at its lowest level in the 20 years he's been in power, at 23%. His support is at 60%. Now that might seem high by Western standards. In Russian standards, it isn't. He has been much higher in terms of support in the past. 60% is just about at his low point. 40% of Russians say the country is moving in the wrong direction. 42% say it's moving in the right direction. But 40% of Russians, according to Levada, say Russia is moving in the wrong direction. And 45% support the protests in the Far East. That, combined with what's happening in Belarus today, where there has been an ugly crackdown again by Belarus's KGB, and they still call it the KGB in Belarus, and by other security forces and thugs of Lukashenko, is terrifying to Putin. He worries that this kind of popular movement, these revolutions in Ukraine in particular, or Belarus, both Slavic nations, fellow Slavic nations, might spread into Russia and pose a threat to his own grip on power. And so these developments are very disturbing. It's possible we will see Russian troops move into Belarus. I certainly hope not. That would be yet another violation of a neighboring state's sovereignty and territorial integrity should Mr. Putin decide to do that. Belarusians should be able to decide their own future, their own leaders, and Putin should let them do that. That's why it's critically important for the West, meaning both the United States and the European Union together, to send clear signals of support to the people of Belarus, impose sanctions against Lukashenko and others, but just as important, send a very strong signal to Moscow that we will not tolerate another invasion of another neighboring state of Russia. Putin and Russia's national interests don't go together, I would argue. Putin operates based on what's in his best interest, and that often clashes with and conflicts with Russia's national interest. Invading neighboring states is not in Russia's national interest. Trying to destabilize Ukraine, as he tried to do in 2014, is not in Russia's national interest. But it's in Mr. Putin's interest because he thinks a successful, democratic, market-oriented Ukraine more closely integrated with the Euro-Atlantic community would pose a threat to him. And so he'd rather destabilize Ukraine, a country of 45 million people on Russia's border, than to see it prosper and thrive and develop stronger ties with that neighbor. He'd rather try to destabilize the situation in Georgia, where after Russia's invasion in 2008, we continue to see to this day what's called creeping borderization, where Russia tries to move the demarcation line from the ceasefire agreement of 2008 further into Georgian-controlled territory. We see Russia going into Syria, Russia under Putin going into Syria to prop up the murderous Assad regime and engage in its own gross human rights abuses, if not war crimes. That's not in Russia's interest, but it's in Mr. Putin's interest, because just like with Lukashenko and just like with Yanukovych in Ukraine in 2014, he doesn't want to see these leaders fall as the result of popular protests. We see it in Libya, where Mr. Putin is supporting the rebel forces in Libya against the recognized government. And this is now posing a clash with Turkey and other countries. We see a growing, if you will, privatization or even mercenaryization of Russian efforts overseas, where forces like the Wagner Group, which is run by a close ally, Mr. Putin, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's been sanctioned by the United States, is increasingly active, not just in Libya, but in other places in Africa, as well as in Latin America and elsewhere. We see Putin try to describe, as he has now for maybe 16 years, the West as a threat. This started in 2004, right after the Beslan tragedy, a terrorist incident that killed over 300 people, where Putin warned about outside powers trying to take a juicy piece out of Russia. Of course, we saw it in 2007 in Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference, a long tirade against the West, the United States. And we see Putin try to hold up NATO and the EU and the United States as threats to Russia. And yet, again, according to the Levada survey, only 3% of Russians view the US and Europe as threats to Russia. Putin's act is wearing thin, and that's got to be a source of major concern. Lastly, is I think most of you know, late last week, parts of the intelligence community released a report in which it explained and described how Russia once again is interfering in our election this year. This is not a new thing. This is a repeat of 2016, but possibly with newer and even better methods than the last time. But make no mistake, this underscores that Mr. Putin may be struggling at home. That does not make him a less dangerous threat to neighbors and other countries well beyond Russia's borders. And that includes a threat to the United States. So we need to have a very clear-eyed perception of what's going on with Mr. Putin, a leader who is on the ropes, but a leader who also looks for ways to deflect attention from what's happening at home. He's been in power, not as long as Lukashenko, but he's been in power for over 20 years, if you count his prime minister stint in 1999. And I think a lot of Russians, just like a lot of Belarusians are fed up with Lukashenko, a lot of Russians are getting tired of Mr. Putin, since he doesn't offer hope or vision for the future, and instead, as Tatiana described, simply wants to hold on to power possibly until 2036, because that's the only thing he really cares about at the end of the day.
Thanks, David. And to that last point, I think Secretary Pompeo came out recently and offered a $10 million reward for information linking disinformation operations around the U.S. elections back to Russia. And so certainly something that's being looked at very carefully. Thank you to all our faculty for some great opening remarks. Before I sort of probe with some questions, I want to give a quick shout out. Our founding dean, John Stack, is joining us. And so Dean Stack, I want to welcome you to your event. And so thanks for joining us. And of course, the prolific Russian expert, Dr. Ralph Clem, is also joining us. And then all the way from Cali, Colombia, Director of the Assessis Research, Dr. Vladimir Ravinsky, is joining us as well. So definitely no shortage of Russian thinkers joining us this morning. So if you have questions, make sure you throw them in the chat box. I see Jean's got one already, and I'll come back and Jean, get your question thrown in. I do have a few questions to kick us off first. So I think as both Rebecca and David sort of alluded to, we're really talking about Russia's weak strong man, right? And that there are certainly elements of weakness embodied in Putin and his leadership and his perception of his grip, to the degree that Tatiana made an excellent argument about the efforts to consolidate power as a means of overcoming that weakness that he has. And so if whether it's for Tatiana or Rebecca, I know David talked a little bit about the sources of Putin's decline in popularity, but do you think the polls are in fact reflecting the reality? Is Putin really in decline in terms of his favorability among the Russian people? And how do you think Putin is going to respond to that beyond perhaps some of the consolidation efforts that we've already talked about? So I don't know, Rebecca or Tatiana, if either one of you want to sort of tackle that question.
I can share a few thoughts about this. First of all, about the polls, I think that we need to analyze them with caution. The numbers may not reflect the exact situation because of the dictatorial type, authoritarian type of government. So we know that after the these constitutional amendments were passed by the Russian parliament, there was a series of actions against opposition leaders, and this is when the Khabarovsk governor that David just talked about was arrested and removed, and there was some other instances as well. So it's possible that not all respondents in these surveys answer the questions honestly, because some of them really fear. There is still fear so many years after, but remember that the previous regime was for 70 years, and this regime was actually praised by Mr. Putin. So in many ways. So I don't think that the surveys reflect reality. I think that these results are somewhat biased. It's hard to say how biased they are. I just want to kind of draw your attention to a fact that we saw in 1989, when the communist regimes in Eastern Europe fell all of a sudden. We saw a different picture later because of the fear that existed before that. We didn't have the right picture of how people felt, and these sentiments and feelings, suddenly it turned out that they were much stronger, the anti-regime sentiments, than they were caught by different experts. So this is something that I think, with regards to this regime and whether it has been the intention of Mr. Putin from the very beginning, I wanted to emphasize something that I didn't have time in my remarks, opening remarks to say, is that it's not the first time when constitutional amendments are made or efforts to change the constitution in favor of the sitting president and solidifying of the concentration of power at the center. Since the very beginning, there have been several attempts that were made to either revise certain parts of the constitution or change certain things, but not of the magnitude that we saw now, this whole package. So it shows that from the beginning he was trying to concentrate more power into his hands, and the fact that he continues to do it shows some insecurity. He worries that the protest, I agree with David, that they are a sign of some sort of weakness. He's not certain whether he would be able to hold to power for all this time. Now, in 2008 or 2007, 2008, it was enough for him just to say, well, it's a matter of interpretation of the Constitution. It shouldn't be interpreted this way, but that way. So he managed to put Medvedev and then replace him again. Now, it seems to me that it's not enough to play the game, the trick with the interpretation. He wants it solidified in the Constitution itself, and this shows a sign of insecurity.
Thanks, Tatiana. Rebecca.
Just very quickly, I mean, I would agree with everything Tatiana said, which is to say, I think we can't really trust the opinion polls. That's, I mean, of course not on some level. It depends who you ask, right? I mean, all along you ask, members of the intellectual class, and they've never liked Putin. And so there's always been a disconnect, again, depending upon who you ask. I also just want to say that in my very fun weekend research about Putin and his image in more recent times, it seems that a lot, I probably should have known this, but it seems that a lot of the images that we have in our minds of him come from his birthday celebrations and the vacations he takes for his birthday. And I guess in the last one, I just read an article that suggested in the last one, he really was lacking that same kind of like macho imagery. He looked old, he had a cane, he looked weaker. So to answer your question as to what's coming, I think that there's a way in which it's a really interesting moment, because as the crackdown is happening through the referendum and so forth, he himself is kind of weakening. So let's see. I'm a historian. I'm not a predictor of the future, but it's an interesting moment.
I may ask for everybody to break out that crystal ball as we get deeper in the program. But David, I want to give you an opportunity to. So what I'm hearing is that the polls may not be accurate, but nonetheless, whether or not they're accurate, you're still seeing a Vladimir Putin that, his position is weakening. The consolidation of power is really meant to solidify his hold, centralize authorities into the executive to give him greater control. And that's likely a response to the fact that there is some decline in his popularity, or at least his hold over Russia. David, any thoughts on that?
Well, just to say, Tatiana's caveats on polling are absolutely right. But what's striking is how badly Putin is doing in these polls when people are afraid to give their honest answers. Levada is the most respected independent polling agency in Russia. And the pandemic has created problems for them to go knocking on doors or meeting people out in public. So they're doing most of this by phone. And most Russians would be paranoid and concerned about answering questions from a total stranger, particularly when some of them, not Levada, but other polling agencies know details about their family and where they live. So it is tricky to do polling in Russia, no question. But even with that, Putin is not doing well. There is no question that his goal has been to solidify the vertical of power. That is the way he feels he can keep things under control. The problem with that is the more you concentrate power in his hands, the more responsible he becomes for the country's problems. And so when there are problems, people expect Putin to address them and fix them. And when he shows repeatedly that he's incapable of doing that, has no idea how to handle any of these problems, support for him is going to wane. And I think that's just normal and natural.
Thanks, David. So let me throw two more questions out, and I'll throw it to the audience, to the panel broadly. And then we do have three really good questions, and I want to integrate those before we conclude today. So one is, and I'll throw both questions out there. So first is, what's really driving Putin's interest in Russian engagement beyond the Baltics? Looking at sort of growth in Russian engagement, almost sort of a rebound in its efforts in the broader international sphere. So looking at places like Africa and Latin America, what do you see really driving that? Number one. And number two, to what degree is U.S. national security policy, foreign policy, driving the prospects of a strategic Sino-Russian alliance? And I know, David, you and I have written on this before, sort of assessing, how genuine of a Sino-Russian alliance could there be, given sort of the back history and so forth. So I'm going to throw those out there, take them in any order, and then I'm going to hit the audience questions. So who wants to take first shot? Rebecca, I saw you unmute real quick. Go for it.
I'll give a brief comment. Not the second one, but the first one. I mean, I think the notion of Russian imperial ambitions is nothing new, that it does kind of echo, not just the Soviet historical record, but the Russian historical record before that. And I would just see it actually as a matter of kind of continuity, exertion of power, kind of second Cold War, post-Cold War, depending how you want to think about that. And at the same time, because it's never one thing, it could also be seen as a sign of weakness, right? So on the one hand, it's a kind of attempt for strength and the broadening of empire. And then on the other hand, maybe it is a kind of, knee-jerk move in hopes of exerting power. So I give you no answers, but food for thought.
Thanks, Rebecca. David.
On the Sino-Russia issue, I would just say that the two countries, China and Russia, share dissatisfaction with the United States. That may be something that unites them. But the history between the two, as you and I have discussed before, Brian, I think is likely to keep them from forming such a tight alliance against us that we should pay attention to it, no question. There have been some military exercises involving the two. But I don't think we're driving Russia and China closer together, other than both are unhappy with the way things have unfolded in the United States. I do worry that the current administration in Washington is so fixated on China. And that's not to say that it's wrong, but it seems to be turning a blind eye to what Russia is up to. The intelligence community, as I mentioned, released this report last week. That's good. We didn't see much reinforcement of it from people in policy positions. And of course, there have been these reports that President Trump doesn't like to hear anything negative about Putin or Russia. He has been averse, to say the least, about criticizing Putin, including about reports that there were Russian bounties against US soldiers in Afghanistan. And if he isn't going to get exercised about that, then I really worry about how he might turn and look the other way when Russia engages in its ongoing interference in our election again. And the Chinese are not as active, but are also up to no good in this area as well.
Thanks, David. And I think in President Trump's recent sort of announcement, looking at China, he alluded so much as that there were prospects of Chinese interference in the elections akin to what we were seeing, maybe not the same magnitude, but akin to what we were seeing with Russian interference in 2016. And so there's no doubt that, again, as you and I have sort of argued back and forth on, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, sort of that concept sort of driving, at least, at a very superficial level, some type of engagement between the two countries looking to mitigate U.S. efforts in the sort of security and geopolitical space. Let me go to Jean's question in the chat box, and I'm going to throw this one out to Tatiana first, and then anyone can take a shot at it. But did Putin ever contemplate a more liberal model for Russia since he acceded to the presidency at the beginning of 2000?
That's a very interesting question. And my answer to it is I doubt it. The way he came to power, the way he related to the Russian political system that existed back then, he was, for example, totally opposed, not opposed, but neglecting the role of political parties. He didn't want to play party politics. He didn't want to communicate even with Unity back then, which was the party that supported Boris Yeltsin. But then step by step, he understood that without building party support, he needed it. So he started building United Russia. But while in the first years of his first term, he had to deal with Chechnya, something that he promised in the election in a very aggressive and violent way. I think that even from the very beginning, there was no genuine interest in building a more democratic Russia. In a way, his first presidency and his second also, it was a rejection of the 1990s. Everything that happened during the 1990s, including democratic changes that were made, were kind of rejected because of the bad situation, economic and social, that the Russian society found itself in, playing the card of, well, let's remember the past, not everything in the past was bad. Stalin did also some good things. Starting to celebrate the day of the Chekists again. All these things point towards in favor of an argument that he didn't plan on deepening democracy in Russia. In fact, he was trying to kind of destroy what he could that was built on in the time of the 1990s. So my answer would be in that sense. I don't think that he was trying. I think he was looking to find a way to, and what helped him back then was the economic situation in the world that helped a lot with the high prices of oil and energy resources that helped him finance his social programs. There was increase in the pensions, increase in salaries, and it did build initial domestic support for him and approval.
Thanks, Tatiana. Rebecca.
Just quickly, at the risk of sounding like a Putin apologist, which I'm not, first of all, I completely agree with everything Tatiana just said. I also think it's important to remember that the question itself is a complex one, because what does that mean, democratic politics, in the context of early Putin years? What does that mean in the context of Russian history? I mean, at that moment when communism fell across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, there were all kinds of discussions about civil society and democracy, and are these societies going to democratize and have a real civil society for the first time? And, or was there a precedent 100 years ago? These are very kind of complicated, multi-layered questions. So I agree that no, I don't think Putin ever imagined that he would have a system that looked like a kind of, you know, pure democracy that exists maybe nowhere. But maybe there were moments in which things might have been different. Let me just put a tiny little optimistic spin.
Brian, can I just add something that I missed to mention, but now that Rebecca started talking about the Russian way of democracy, actually, several years after he came to power, he surrounded himself by theorists and people such as Dugin and others who started creating new labels. They said, yes, we are building democracy, but it's sovereign democracy. Sovereign meaning independent from the Western idea of democracy. Then it became managed democracy. So whatever this means, but you can start imagining that managed democracy should be something more managed from the top by the power vertical and so on and so forth. So yes, there was some talk about democracy, but a different type of democracy under these labels.
It sounds like democracy with Putin characteristics. If I was to kind of play off Chinese, sort of definitions of democratic governance. Let me come to the next question from one of our rock star students, Daniel Sixto. He's asking about whether or not the rising protests in Russia's east symbolize a greater movement in Russia against Putin that could potentially affect him when he runs for his next election, or are they more, sort of consolidated just in the east? Is this a broader underlying issue? And David was first to unmute the mic, so go for it.
Sure, I'll be very quick. Putin certainly hopes it's a regional development, but there is a possibility it could spread. There have been protests I mentioned going back to 2011 and 12 after the Duma elections and Putin's return to the presidency. There were protests last year when Moscow authorities disqualified a number of candidates running for the Moscow City Council. And ordinarily, elections to the Moscow City Council would not generate protests and demonstrations, but the way the authorities mishandled it, they did. We've seen protests in Arkhangelsk and other places over destroying a park to build a church, about landfill coming from Moscow. So I would say increasingly, Russians are getting fed up with the way things have been unfolding. Mr. Putin is not benefiting from something that was beyond his control early on in his presidency, and that is the rise in the price of oil, from which he benefited enormously. Instead, oil is pretty flat. The Russian economy is in trouble. The pandemic is still a major issue there. And so I think as Russians look at their situation both locally and nationally, they don't see a lot of reason for hope if Mr. Putin thinks he's going to stay there for another 16 years.
Thanks for that, David. Tatiana, I think I'm going to direct this one at you, and then Rebecca, David, if you want to jump in. Ralph Clem, my professor, I won't name how long ago, but my professor in my early years, his question is, buried in the morass of amendments is the formalization of Russia's refusal to allow for binding international judicial review if Russian law is overridden. This poses a serious disconnect for Russian membership in the Council of Europe. Do Russians really pay attention to the implications of becoming a more rogue state? Is this something that weighs on the consciousness of Russians, generally speaking?
It's the question about Russia's relationships with different international institutions is very interesting. Yes, Russia is a member of the Council of Europe. There are certain requirements, of course, to be an active member in it. These requirements are much milder. They're not that high and rigorous as the requirements for being a member of the EU. So on the one hand, Russia is in an interesting situation, in my view, because Russia will be trying to normalize relations with international organizations and with the West, with the rest of the world. At the same time, we don't know how COVID would affect this, because some of the concerns are that after COVID, post-COVID, we will be in a new situation where the West may rush into too quickly into normalizing relationships and forgetting about the past. So it's an interesting game that will be played by Russia and international. Right now it's in a kind of not very good relations with the European Union, because the European Union strengthened its policies. It imposed new requirements for countries to approve of Russian projects that go on in Europe. But with the Council of Europe, the relationship, there is no hope there that Russia would be able to keep good relations, at least in that organization, which is not as demanding as some other are.
Thanks, Tatiana. So let me go to Vladimir Ravinsky, good friend from Colombia. His question is, the Russian International Cooperation Agency says that Putin is a brand and that they will use it to promote Russian soft power. Any thoughts on Putin as a brand in the proliferation of Russian soft power around the world? David, I almost thought that, I know that Putin's not a fan of yours. I thought that he took your camera out for a moment there, but it's good to see that you're back.
I had some dog issues to deal with, sorry. Putin obviously tries to play up that he is a defender of traditional values. Tatiana mentioned about the constitutional amendment, the banning gay marriage, for example. So Putin is active on that, and that plays well with certain far-right groups, both in the United States and in Europe. He tries to present himself as a decisive leader. There have also been people on the right who find him to be a man of action, and they admire that. Vyacheslav Volodin, the Speaker of the Russian Duma, the lower house of the parliament, has said that without Putin, there is no Russia. So there certainly is this effort to perpetuate the persona, this almost cult of personality, that if Putin goes, then all hell's going to break loose. But I think that is wearing thin, at least inside Russia. And so it's kind of ironic that as Putin's brand is wearing thin inside his own country, the brand seems to be playing well in certain circles in the West.
Thanks,
David. Tatiana.
Yes, I would agree that there is this Putin brand, but within certain circles, it's not. Hello? Brian, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, something happened with my computer. But within certain circles. And it's amazing how even within the European Union, there are communities where I've heard this, some parts of societies mentioning, well, whatever his policies are, at least he projects this strength. So the image that he's trying to build for himself, the outer image, apparently works on some people, and then within the country, it's even more so, perhaps. At least that's why he's trying to emphasize all the time the crisis. The crisis is important because he can emerge only in a crisis. He can emerge as the leader for the country, so that people can rally around him. And there are still quite a few people in Russia who believe that they need a strong leader, and this is the strong leader for them. Almost doesn't matter where he's leading them, but if they are told through the media that is controlled, or through other channels that the West thinks only the worst for them, then it works. It works as a brand.
Thanks, Tatiana. Adriana, another rock star, recent graduate, has a question about influence over Putin. So she says that it's highlighted that Putin doesn't have all the power, or as much as folks think, that there are oligarchs that also influence his decisions. How much influence do these groups have over him, and is there a shift in any of these groups' commitment to Putin? And so whoever wants to take that one first. Tatiana, you're unmiked, and then David, unmiked quick too.
Well, when Putin first came to power, there were experts' analysis that revealed that he was a project of KGB, of the Siloviki circles. in Russia. That he just didn't came because Yeltsin liked his loyalty on a personal level. That he was a project. It was something behind the scenes that was decided. So then we know also how he worked with the oligarchs. Some oligarchs were favored, other oligarchs were forced out of the country, and then there were those who ended up in jail. But over time, I think he built for himself an image of this strong leader that that nobody can influence him. Although we have, when I say we, because in conversations with experts, I have heard also other people agreeing that there are good reasons to believe that it's more than that. There are also other people who would be interested in keeping him. And deciding the future. It is hard to calculate to what extent he is autonomous in his decisions and to what extent he is still within those circles, networks that survived after 1991 in Russia, and they're still able to shape his decisions and even impose their own rule on him.
Just quickly, you know, in 2001, soon after he came to power as president, he seized two nationwide TV stations from Boris Berezovsky, who played an important role in Putin's rise to power, and from Vladimir Gusinsky, whom he then arrested, threw in jail, and then forced into exile. In 2003, as Tatiana alluded to, he arrested the richest man in Russia, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, put him in jail for 10 years. And by that point, the other oligarchs got the message: fall in line or else you will pay a steep price. And yet it is all a kleptocracy. They're all corrupt. They're all ripping off the country, frankly, and they're all benefiting from each other. So none of them wants to pull the thread at the risk that the whole thing unravels and falls apart. But there are certainly some favorite oligarchs these days who build bridges from Russia to Crimea, who build all the construction for the Sochi Olympics and other things. And then there are some oligarchs who have fallen out of favor, like Mr. Abramovich, who is spending most of his time outside of the country. So it's a love-hate relationship to some extent. But after Khodorkovsky's arrest in 2003, none of them has dared to stick his neck, and it's him mostly, has dared to stick his neck up at the risk of having his head get cut off.
Thanks, David. So I want to go to the next question. We have time for two more. Lorraine, first and foremost, is a huge fan of Rebecca, and so just want to point that out. But her question, however, is for David. In your discussion, you mentioned both the instability in Belarus and separately Wagner's activities worldwide. What is your assessment on the alleged Wagner presence in Belarus? She's referring to the 33 detained alleged Wagner mercenaries in Minsk who are accused of plotting a riot during the 9 August elections, these recent elections. Any thoughts on that?
So 10 days before the election, Belarusian authorities rounded up and arrested 33 members of the Wagner Group. Again, this mercenary outfit that is run and owned by Yevgeny Prigozhin, a close ally of Putin. It seemed incredibly convenient for Lukashenko to have found these guys, and he claims that there were 170 others elsewhere in the country, because it enabled him to play up, if you don't vote for me, then the Russians are going to come in and invade us kind of hype. So it's very mysterious. The Kremlin has given conflicting stories to explain what happened. They were on their way to the Middle East. They were on their way to Venezuela. They were on their way here, there, and everywhere. And yet it is a bizarre episode that caused some friction, I think, between Moscow and Minsk, unless it was all orchestrated, which can't be ruled out. So it's a bit of a mystery to this day, I'd say.
Good point. Tatiana, your mic's unmuted. Did you have something you want to add there?
I would say that some observers commented on the fact that maybe this is another sign that Putin is trying to interfere into Belarusian politics, not only in the election itself, but they saw this as a piece of evidence that exists there. But again, I wouldn't go further and to make a more concrete assessment of that.
Thanks, Tatiana. One other sort of caveat to that, though, is that the groups like the Wagner Group, at least the Wagner Group specifically, isn't always on the best of terms with the Russian military. There's actually some really solid documented history of tension between the Russian military and the Wagner Group. And so how Russia deploys, or how Putin specifically is able to leverage groups like the Wagner Group is still pretty hotly debated, but nonetheless used in the international space as a source of influence, destabilizing influence at that. Okay, so Daniel, I'm gonna jump over your question about the Sino-Russo. We have time for two more, and I want to go to Adriana. Although Putin is seen as the epitome of the male masculinity, his weakness seems to be on the rise and growing tiresome with the Russian people. Her question is, with 40% of Russians agreeing Russia is going in the wrong direction, does the possibility of a revolutionary uprising in the likes of the Bolshevik Revolution appear inevitable in modern times? So Tatiana, you have your mic unmuted. I don't know if that's to jump in. Rebecca's ready to go as well, so go for it. Tatiana first and then Rebecca.
Okay, that is an interesting question, because we know about so much about, well, at least we've always been impressed with the events of the Russian Revolution and how they changed the world and world politics. But whether there can be a revolutionary situation, to use the Marxist terminology, that's a different issue. If we try to answer these questions by looking at the opposition who might be leading such an effort, first of all, we see there are protests. It's a good sign that protests now happen also in other parts of the country, because it used to be only in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So quickly, those were called by the regime, well, these are people who are pro-Western. They are they serve Soros. They are Sorosoids. They want to make our country a gender country or whatever, with all these Western liberal values. So they would quickly be discredited. But now we see other parts of the country, and this is a sign for citizen engagement and more engagement in protest actions. On the other hand, when we speak about political organized opposition, that's a different issue, because what we have in the Russian Duma is where the main arena of political conflict is. We see that the main opposition is the Communist Party, that had not even renamed itself. So it's the Communist Party that is very much, that was weakened over the course of all those years. So it doesn't have the legislative strength, the votes needed to even to stop constitutional amendments or do whatever. And then you have all these other groups that somehow cooperate with the regime or were politically engineered by the regime. So I don't see who, maybe the communists still think that they can mobilize support if things get really very bad in terms of the economic situation. But how much worse can they be? I mean, they're bad right now also. And then you have these leaders of different leaders that we hear about within Russian society. The best, one of the examples would be Alexei Navalny, but also a few others that spent so many days in jail because they are quickly taken by the regime any time when they try to organize something or mobilize people for some sort of support. So a revolution of that magnitude, I don't foresee it, at least in the near future. It's at least for me, it's hard to. It may happen one day if a very broad movement organizes. But right now, in the near future, I can't see it. But I also wanted to mention something else. The other thing that puts more pressure on the regime now is the COVID situation, because many European countries have closed their borders for coming Russians. So all these Russians that are stuck in Russia, so the regime cannot even send them abroad. I mean, they're stuck there, and they stay there. Frustration grows, and maybe they will start mobilizing more groups around themselves. We don't know, but the COVID crisis kind of continues this sense that that there is something brewing in the country, but we don't know yet to what extent it could be successful.
Thanks, Tatiana. Rebecca, you have a brief intervention? Go for it.
Okay. First, I just have to take a second to say the questions are amazing. I do these all the time, and I'm so impressed with the depth of the questions. So thank you, audience. And also, hello, Lori, who is my first PhD student. That's why she's such a fan. Anyway, so what I want to say is, like, is there going to be, 1917, whether February or October? I would suggest not likely at all. That the context is entirely different. I think the protests are wonderful that we see in Moscow and all around the country, different parts. But what that indicates, if anything, is that some people feel some sense of freedom enough to go out on the streets and protest and assert their political opinions, which maybe is civil society more than revolution.
Thanks, Rebecca. And look, we do have such great questions that I don't want to stop the conversation. So if you'll stick with us a few more minutes, there are 4 other questions I want to try to get to, and hopefully hold all the questions at this point. So we'll round out this last set. I did want to hit Paul's question about, so without voting manipulation, is there any indication that Russian citizens are sufficiently happy with their lot to elect him? Not sure. Yeah, David, go for it.
I mean, very briefly, it's an impossible question to answer, because in a system like Putin has set up, you can't get a real assessment of what people honestly believe, given the control that the government exercises. That's why Putin took over nationwide TV in 2001. That has been, up until recently, the main means by which Russians get their news and information.
Good, thanks, David. Okay, I want to go to. We do have a question in from Facebook from Dina, who joins us. She's on the faculty at University of Miami. So Dina, thanks for joining us. She's got a few questions, but I'll throw them all out there, and then if you can hit them as briefly and in any order that you want. What's your opinion of an ultimate goal of the Russian regime or state? Is the advancement of economic interests? Is it the advancement of the economic interests of the elite? What's the role of a great power narrative in Russian foreign policy? And then last, is it a mere tool of manipulation of public opinion and consolidation of power, or do Russian elites genuinely consider Russia to be a great power that has been mistreated by the West? All right, a lot to unpack there. David, unmuted, go for it.
I'll answer quickly. I think that the main goal for Putin is to stay in power. That's been his goal almost from day one, because he's afraid if he gives up power, and it's why the constitutional changes were rammed through. He's afraid of what might happen if he were to surrender power. So I think that's the driving force behind this. Yes, there's a narrative that they feel they've been mistreated, disrespected, taken advantage of, particularly in the 1990s. But again, if 3%, according to Levada, with all the caveats about surveys, view Europe and the United States as a threat, then his narrative is running out of steam.
Thanks, David. Tatiana, did you want to add? Or
I will add something very quickly. I think that, to me, the main goal that Putin is to make Russia be recognized again as a great power. I think this is something that he wants very much to do. It would help him internationally. It would help him also domestically.
Thanks, Tatiana. Rebecca, go for it.
Our very own president as well, and they're both failing miserably.
Rebecca, can you restate that briefly? Because I think your mic cut off on us. No.
I always never say anything as brilliantly the second time. I said I think that is true of Putin, and I think it is also true of Trump, of our very own president. The kind of attempt to project an image that is, there's a huge disconnect between the image and the reality. And ultimately, I suggested they're both failing miserably. We can just end there, Brian. I mean, come on now.
Okay, I'm not sure if Max's question is rhetorical, but I want to ask it anyway. How did Putin get 78% approval if he's so unpopular? David, I'm going to throw it at you.
I'll give you 2 sentences in response. The same way Lukashenko got 82% in yesterday's election, which is you rig it and it's fraudulent. And the second is, this quote is attributed to Stalin, it's not the people who vote that count, it's the people who count the votes. And as long as the Putin regime controls the Central Election Commission and the way elections are conducted, then he'll get the result he wants.
David, that would be an excellent way to end this, but I don't want to miss Daniel's question. He had a second question. He threw it out. This is the last question. And I think it's an important one, though. Is Central Asia a possible source of tension in any type of Sino-Russian alliance?
There's competition certainly between the two countries there. I would say actually Chinese influence is on the rise, Russian influence is on the decline. The Chinese have more to offer economically than the Russians do. And the Russians, though, have a lot of military interests there. So I think it will be the source of ongoing competition between the two for influence in the region.
All right, thanks, David. And so how about we end there? First off, thanks so much for the audience that stuck around. We normally try not to take these things into the hour-plus mark, but we had so many really good questions that we didn't want to miss the opportunity to continue the discussion. So thank you all for joining us. If you can, a round of applause, even if it's off screen, for our 3 brilliant faculty that are here to support sort of deepening our understanding of what's going on with the Putin persona and the future of Russia. So Dr. Friedman, Dr. Kostadinova, Mr. David Kramer, thank you so much for joining us. And with that, it's a wrap. We conclude this session. Thank you all. Have a good week.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.